if McConnell can get it through, he's going to do it. None of them care about what happened, what they said 4 years ago. Even McConnell's jumping through these hoops. Well, he said that if the Senate matches the president and all this kind of stuff, like they're going to do what it takes to win, which is one thing you got to say for the Republicans is they win, right? I don't like how they do it. I think they effectively cheat and break the rules, but they sort of have a backbone that the Democrats don't seem to have.
Well, part of it is the structural incentives of polarization, which is that we saw asymmetric polarization. I mean, again, this goes sort of back to what we were talking about earlier, where I claimed that if the Democrats were in the situation where they were losing power, they would probably be breaking the rules just as much. Part of the reason for that, of course, is that we saw asymmetric polarization on the part of Republicans, which is that the Republican Party was polarizing when the Democratic Party was not. The Democratic Party was remaining consistent, while the Republican Party has moved. So, this is a situation where, because of that, Republican voters became more afraid of Democratic voters, and so were willing to vote for Republicans, even when they didn't necessarily agree with all the things that they were doing, but because they were so afraid of the Democrats. So someone in the chat here saying the tables have changed. The left has become so radical. The conservatives have to get a new judge in there before the left leads this nation into the ground, in my opinion. Good channel, by the way. Yeah, so, I mean, I disagree with you. I mean, this is sort of a left-leaning. My views are much more left-leaning. I understand that position, right? Like, again, as we were talking about, asymmetric polarization and motion is relative, right? So conservatives and Republicans have been moving rightward for the past, I'd say, 2 decades. Most research seems to suggest that it was asymmetric polarization, but then around 2015 or 2014, we started seeing the Democratic Party also move left as well. And, whoever's moving, right? Like if the Republican Party is moving, then they're going to see the Democrats as moving, unless you have some kind of neutral way or Archimedean point to judge things from a distance. So it's hard to tell, right? Like it's obviously hard to tell. So tell me what you think about this. We were talking earlier that you haven't. Do you guys have any concerns that the left is moving too far left? No, I don't have that concern. However, I do think that we need to talk about building out institutions which are less politicized. I mean, we were talking earlier, I think, Chris, you disagreed with me a little bit about the importance of depoliticizing the Supreme Court. I don't think that it's healthy, in my view, no matter what political issue, what side of the political aisle you come down on, I don't think that it's healthy to have a Supreme Court that's so political where, you have an 87-year-old who was in poor health dying and the whole country is put into this, put into a crazy state, and it feels like, the pressure is just ranked up. I think that my view on it is that we need to talk about ways in which we can reform our institutions so that they're less politicized. I actually do think that having faith in institutions is really important for the maintenance of government, and that means that it's not healthy for politicians to rail against institutions. And part of that, of course, means that institutions need to be responsive to the people. Excuse me, I need to get some water. What do you think about that, Chris?
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that point. I think it would be great if our judicial branch, right, the Supreme Court, that judicial branch was not political. That would be great. What the point that I was making was that we're not there. Like it is political, and it's going to stay political for probably the rest of our lives. I think it's going to be very political, at least for a generation from now.
Well, here's the thing, though. I think that it can become depoliticized specifically by again instituting some of those reforms that we were talking about earlier. First you pack the court and balance it, and then B, you institute some kind of rotating system so that every president gets a certain number of judges, and that, okay, if you want to get more judges, you have to win the presidency, and this isn't about this kind of game. And again, like I was saying earlier, if Hillary Clinton had won in 2016, and again, she won the popular vote, if she had won, then packing the courts would be something that would benefit Republicans. It's not something that would benefit Democrats. And my guess is we'd probably be hearing those kinds of arguments. Like you were saying, you would think that those arguments are hypocritical, but I suspect that we would probably be starting to hear those arguments, how we need to pack the courts because, the liberals are taking over the courts. And so my view on it is that packing the courts shouldn't be something that is a partisan issue. It's just something that we need to do to make sure that we can balance the court. And then when you pack it, I think that the way to communicate that to voters is say, as soon as we do that, we're not going to pack the courts without instituting the system where it rotates judges so that then everybody gets their say and everybody gets their pick, and we don't have these explosions where, some person dies and then the whole country goes into turmoil. I mean, that's controversial, but I think that that's the solution.
I would support those reforms, but I mean, you're going to need, that's a constitutional amendment, right? Because you're changing the terms
most of it, yeah,
of those. So I mean, the likelihood of any constitutional amendment getting passed in the next 10 years, I don't see it, right? So that's all I'm saying is just sort of trying to stay
right.
Like,
we have so
I like
many
what
problems,
you're saying, but I don't see us getting to that point. I don't see
well,
the path.
Right.
That
Well,
gets
part
us
of the
there
problem,
and those things through.
well, part of the reasons though is because nobody wants to talk about institutional reforms, because it's always easier to talk about policy than talking about reforms to institution, because people vote on policy, but they don't vote on institutional reform, which is what the vast majority of government and what politics is actually about.
But that's not going to change anytime soon either. I mean, I get what you're saying, but I think people are going to continue to be concerned about that.
But who cares? But who cares that it's not going to change? Is my view. Like who cares? Whatever. Like, let's start making the arguments so that we can start advancing that agenda. Because oftentimes I hear people and they'll only talk about the things that they can do in the short run, but the things that you can do in the short run distinctly and oftentimes turn against the things that you want to do in the long run. Because if you only do the short run things, you're never going to be able to do the long run things, because you actually need to do the long run things in order to do the short run things. Like, in order to get those minor policy changes and minor policy adjustments, you actually have to modify the institutions first. And so I think that, talking about the things that we can do, and I imagine it sounds like we, have a sort of disagreement here, but my view on it is that it's kind of like unproductive, or not unproductive, but it isn't going to really get us where we want to go. We can have this debate if you want.
Well, no, I mean, I wish we lived in a world where we could push through reforms like that through. I would, like I've said, I would like to see those reforms get through. I don't think people are going to be open to that idea of completely changing the way we rotate those judges on both sides of the aisles. I don't see that flying, right? So it's really just a matter of, I don't think that second thing is going to come about. I'm fine with talking about it and messaging it and getting people used to that idea. So maybe down the road, it could be adopted. I don't have any problem with that. I'm fine with that being in the conversation. I'm just saying in the short term, I think there's a set of rules we have to push forward so that we can just keep our heads above water and not have a country that's fallen apart or be sort of a religious monarchy in a few years from now or something.
What rules do you think those are? Oh, by the way, thanks for the follow. What rules do you think those are?
Well, which thing are you referring to about
what kind of modifications can we have to make sure that we can maintain our democracy that are not finally institutional reforms? Like, don't you think that the institutional reforms need to come first? Because, voters don't care about institutional reforms, but unfortunately, institutional reforms are necessary in order to get the policy done. But the policy is the thing that voters vote on, which is just this.
Reforms.
Huh? But I'm saying,
I don't want to ignore those. By all means, I have a laundry list of things.
Right.
I know
we agree on that.
We need to change.
Right. I know we agree on that. Well, as I say, I know we agree on that, but my deep concern is that the only way to get voters sort of turned on is that you end up appealing only to the policies. Like, I'm going to increase the minimum wage, or I'm going to do this thing or that thing or the other thing. But then it turns out that in order to do those things, you need to engage in serious institutional reform, and progressives need to reflect deeply on the limits of government. I think that progressives sort of paint themselves into a kind of box sometimes, where because of the fact that we've been arguing with conservatives who oftentimes, or I should say libertarians really, who, just don't really support government action at all, that, we create these arguments that government can do all sorts of things. But it turns out that, yes, you could do all sorts of things for government, but government has limitations as it currently exists. And so you have to build out the institutions in order to make it possible that those kinds of policies, those kinds of radical things that you might want can actually get through. I'll give a specific example, Medicare for all. I've said many times I support Medicare for all, maybe even a more so NHS style system, right? However, if I'm being honest with you, if we just straight up passed Medicare for all today, I actually don't think, like, look, I want that, okay? So I'm not like criticizing it, but my point being that in the bill to pass Medicare for all, we would have to make institutional reforms in terms of, for instance, how quickly checks can go around in the federal government. Like, you'd have to pay a lot more people, and checks go really slow. But that would, of course, require funding the IRS, for example. Like, in other words, there's a lot of institutional tweaks that would need to be made in order for Medicare for all to run smoothly. But those are the kinds of things which are oftentimes get defunded or get derailed or get criticized by even Democrats or things like that. Maybe not the IRS example, but like, in other words, like, there are institutional examples where, like, in order to pass any particular policy, you need to modify the extent and scope in which government can possibly act before you can go ahead and institute the actions. I think that progressives and socialists and whoever need to think clearly and think honestly about the limits of government as it exists. That doesn't mean that government can't go on and do those things, but you have to do things in order to make it so that government can do those things. Am I making sense, or am I just...
Somewhat. I think maybe you and I could be wrong here, but maybe you and I disagree about the world that we actually live in. I guess part of this is, I don't think you're going to convince people to make those kind of differences, because that's going to take telling people on the right, don't pick a really right judge, pick someone centrist. And then also telling people on the left, when it's your turn, you don't pick someone that's too far left. You got to pick someone in the middle that's not just going to
I don't agree with that.
Well, if you're trying to not politicize the Supreme Court, I was talking in terms of the Supreme Court. If you're trying to not politicize it, you don't want people on the extreme ends of that spectrum, right? Otherwise, it will inherently be political. So if you're trying to pick people like Merrick Garland that are closer to the middle,
I'm not concerned with the individual actions in a system. I'm interested in how we can create incentives to make sure that that we can, like, for instance, maintain the kind of pressures that exist. So again, I mean, we've talked about this in other streams before, but, you know, in the case of the 1960s, the polarization on the streets among the people was far worse than the polarization that we've seen today. But because of the way that the institutions were set up and the way that the institutions were arranged, where you had the Dixiecrats in the Democratic Party who were racist, but were sort of more left-leaning on certain economic issues, or at least willing to compromise with left-leaning Democrats. And then you, as a result of that, you had liberal Republicans, which is to say Republicans who were left-leaning in the Republican Party. And so if you looked at the institutional map of the in Congress, for example, you had you basically, it didn't look like the country was polarized, right? Because you had cross-party voting. And so as a result, we didn't have the issue where we have right now, where, for instance, we don't have checks and balances, because our Constitution is set up in such a way that we have checks and balance, where we're supposed to have checks and balances, where the executive checks the Supreme Court and the et cetera, right? Like the branches are supposed to check one another. We all learned this in elementary school. But then what we end up having right now is essentially where the parties check across branches. That's why when the Democrats picked up the House in 2018, it was, oh, now we have a check. Now we have a check on the executive branch, right? And so this is a situation where, because of the fact that our institutions have been reshaped in such a way that it's impossible to have a serious check. So I don't actually care too much about how individuals act in a particular system. Okay. Like they act how they act, and left-leaning people are going to pick left-leaning judges. Right-leaning people are going to pick right-leaning judges. The question is like, what individuals do, they're going to do what they do. The question is, how can we build out institutions which are capable of handling political polarization? The fact that people are polarized right now, and again, it isn't an extreme level of polarization compared to the polarization that we've seen in the past, even in the 1960s, when our institutions, because of the way that the parties were split, were able to handle that pressure, even though the polarization on the streets and among the people was far worse than the polarization is today. So I'm interested in how we can build out institutions that allow everybody to express their own views in a democratic fashion. So I'm not saying that individuals should that we should rely. I think that that's a terrible mistake, relying on individuals to constrain themselves, saying I'm a socialist, but I'm just going to pick a moderate. I think that that's just naive, relying on that kind of guardrailness. Then you have people like Donald Trump who come in and just don't care about guardrails, or people like Mitch McConnell who just don't care about guardrails, and you get exactly the situation that we have right now. We have been relying on natural, instinctual, personal virtue as opposed to relying on institutions that are going to naturally check individuals.
Yeah, so it might be a little bit of like, which is the cause and effect. It seems to me that one of the reasons our institutions have been degraded is because of the polarization. Like, and I think there's a bit of a cycle. There's a bit of a feedback loop. So it's also fair to say that part of the reason that we're so, let's see, am I going to say it backwards again? But it seems to me like if we're going to put a stop to that and stop the breaking down of these institutions, you're going to have to rely on the very people who are breaking them down.
Yeah, no, you're right. In order to start. In order to get the material institutions in such a place where that, in the future, ambition could counteract ambition. That's a quote from the Federalist Papers, which clearly did not end up panning out. They said, men need not be angels. Rather, we should set it be that ambition would counteract ambition, right? And so I think that in order to do that, it does actually ironically require men to be angels in a certain sense temporarily by creating these I don't know that objective institutions exist, creating institutions which can allow political pressures to build up. However, the important modification on that is nobody's perfectly rational. And so my view, and this is where, it gets controversial, I think that we should have a constitution that has some kind of sunset clause. That doesn't mean every 20 years, but the Constitution should have some kind of sunset clause and some kind of institutional body. This is going to be very, very difficult to write up how it could be fair. But the institution should get rearranged every once and again, because new research comes out. Economics has evolved a lot in the past 30 years. Political science has evolved a lot in the past 50 years. Let's update our form of government every now and again, and I think that would be a
healthy thing. The problem that always scares me about that is who's in charge at the moment that you rewrite things, and then that laundry list that I've been talking about here between Roe v. Wade, gay marriage, police rules, how we do policing, Obamacare, unions, all that stuff, that's all on the table then. And you could end up in a situation where that stuff is all worse off than it is now. I guess that's my main fear when we talk about that. And I agree. We're still dealing with rules where people didn't have things like modern guns. You didn't have things like the internet. You didn't have automobiles, right? Mm-hmm. You didn't have planes. Our world is completely different than it was when the Constitution was written. It would be nice if we had a method for updating that, but which there are. But I mean, with this polarized nation, we're not going to get amendments passed or anything like that.
And it's also polarized in a very specific way. Our founders, when they envisioned if there ever would be political parties, they thought that it would be regional political parties, which would exist solely along the lines of states. And part of the reason for that is because they assumed that voters would, and just people in general, would vote along their material self-interest, and that their material self-interest would be aligned to the sort of industries that were available in a particular region, right? And so any particular region would, sort of check one another in a certain sense. That's why the Senate, which has a larger geographical body than in the House per representative, was thought that it would be more rational, more objective, and more discerning, because it would include more interest in that it was trying to balance, right? That's why, for instance, the Senate was given, this is specifically the argument that Alexander Hamilton uses to justify the fact that the Senate should be the body who determines the final judgment on impeachment trials, right? And so, this is I think a situation where the founders had a certain vision of human nature, and that certain vision of human nature turned out to not be quite right, especially in light of technological change. It turned out that individuals could, through long-distance communication, travel, and that, honestly, ideas were perhaps a little bit more influential than the founders perhaps imagined, that you can actually persuade people, not necessarily to vote against their self-interest, but to perceive their self-interest differently, and to think about their self-interest in a certain way, rather than in another way. And it also turns out that race was a major factor in a way that the founders never envisioned, or at least perhaps they did envision, but they thought could be suppressed through slavery. And so it ends up being quite complicated. And I think that we need to update our institutions in order to take account of all the things that we've learned in the past 200 some years.
So, and I would, yeah, again, I'd be fine if we packed the courts and then reformed how they were done. I think it would lead to more consistency where you would have people coming in and out. So let me ask you a question, because this is a real possibility. Biden wins, they pack the court, but there's no plans for changing institutionally how the Supreme Court works, right? So like the institutional type changes that you're talking about. Do you support
The rotating
that
judges, the rotating judges?
Yeah, if it doesn't come with any of that kind of stuff, do you still support the packing?
I do in order to for as like a short-term solution, but I don't think it'll be popular. I think you do that, Democrats are going to lose in the House and Senate in the midterms.
Yeah, and so we got a nice compliment here from Public Citizen. Gentlemen, you really ought to debate some of these right wingers. You both make very good points. Thanks, Public. Definitely appreciate it there.
Yeah, appreciate it.